Hi everybody and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and my wormery consists of this shelf over here with all these plastic tubs on it. The plastic tubs all have worms in them, and I use these systems for composting my kitchen scraps and paper scraps and all kinds of different things. And something I've been doing lately with my systems is I've been kind of breaking away from the conventional mode of finishing a bin, relocating the worms, and then harvesting the castings and using them for gardening. I've been kind of inserting this extra step in there, which is to hang on to the cocoons, which is basically the castings. The castings, after the worms have been separated, I assume has cocoons in it. So you'll notice that a number of my bins, like the one right here, this has cocoons in it, or at least that's the way I labeled it, with the assumption that there's cocoons in it. Same thing down here. This system also has a similar label. And all that really consisted of was me hanging onto the castings, and rather than sending them out to the garden and using them for that purpose, hanging onto them just for a little while to give the cocoons that I assume are in there some time to hatch and the baby worms to emerge, so that at some point in the near future we can try to round up those baby worms and get them into the, the bin where the rest of their family is, and then we could kind of treat that as a finished batch of, worm castings. So in this case right here, the African night crawlers are the ones that I'm checking in on today. It's been 9 days since we last checked in on these systems. And at that time, we put food into both systems. Here it was just your typical feeding. But in the case of the cocoon nursery, as I call it, my feeding is happening in a very isolated spot, one portion of the bin, in the hopes that I can kind of lure the baby worms as they emerge from their cocoons over into that area of the bin, so that at some point I could do a scoop out, a haul out of the worms. And after 47 days, I would think we're probably getting pretty close to the finish line with this one. So we're going to get these systems up onto the bench. We're going to check in on both of them. I plan to feed the regular bin, and I'm not sure what we're going to do with the cocoon nursery, since I think we're getting pretty close to the end. We'll talk more about it up on the bench, so let's get to work. We're starting in the so-called cocoon nursery. So let's pull back the cover and see what we've got going on here. It's a collection of the castings that came out of 2 active systems. Right away you can see a worm hanging out over here on the surface. And the other thing that I often have a hard time seeing, because they're rather slow-moving critters, are the mites. But like, I could see a little collection of white specks over here and over here. And those are the mites that I know populate this material, and they populate it pretty densely from what I can tell. I can also see some of the more fast-moving, dark-colored mites. A lot of times I'll shoot a little bit of time-lapse here on the surface right after uncovering it, just to get a better sense of exactly what's living here on the surface. And especially with the slow-moving stuff. So I'm going to do that here once again, as I normally do, just to give me a little point of reference as to how things are progressing in here with the mites. So let's take a look at how things look with the time-lapse footage. So I usually feel that about 10 or 15 seconds worth of time-lapse is sufficient to reveal the activity of some of these slow-moving creatures. Some of the mites are pretty fast-moving, the darker colored ones, but it's these white-colored ones that I think are easiest to see when you can play back about 15 minutes worth of time in about 15 seconds. Because I'm shooting 2 frames. No, I'm shooting 1 frame every 2 seconds. So every 60 seconds, I'm left with 30 frames, which equates to 1 second of playback, because my videos are prepared at 30 frames per second. And so yeah, I've been standing here for 15 minutes watching all this very slow-moving activity and just waiting for the time-lapse to conclude. What I did last time, I'm not just, tolerating the mites. I've been doing many things, as a matter of fact, over many months. And the one thing that's going on in this particular bin is an attempt at trying to knock out the mite population using this neem cake, or neem seed meal. So last time we were in this bin, I had treated this top surface of the paper with neem seed meal in the hopes that whatever mites do turn out here on the surface, mainly for the moisture that collects beneath the plastic, that they'll they'll ultimately end up consuming this stuff, and then this stuff theoretically interferes with their reproductive cycle. So in theory, it's not going to kill these particular mites, but it's going to prevent these particular mites from having offspring, ideally eliminating the next generation. And I guess, I don't have enough knowledge about mites and their life cycle or their age or how long it takes for, the old ones to eventually die off and then all that sort of stuff. So I don't even exactly know how much time I should allow for this to occur. So I'm just kind of allowing this to continue on as sort of a test. Because, after this much time, you would have to assume that the cocoons that were in this material after 47 days have probably all hatched. With all the yummy foods that we've been putting in here for a while now, you would also have to assume that the majority of the worms have probably already made their way over here. So we're just going to do a quick inspection of how the feeding area is looking. If it looks like the majority of the food that we placed in here last time has been depleted, we'll just drop in a little bit more. And I'm just going to allow this whole thing to just continue. Last time we were in here 9 days ago, I believe I did hint at the prospect of fishing out worms and hauling them out. But like I said then too, I'm in no particular hurry. So I figured I would just wait and maybe do kind of a larger haul out at some point in the future. Just allowing time for the babies to congregate. And definitely here you can see like a little collection of little baby worms. Worms that I would have to assume were all probably born in this bin. And I know that there's some larger size worms in here too. I'm sure that my screening process was not 100% in terms of screening out the larger worms. So I'm sure a few slipped through. That's probably why we're seeing a couple more mature worms in the mix. But the majority of what I'm observing down here in this feeding area is baby worms. And it certainly looks like we've got a pretty good number of them too. Definitely nice turnout down here. I just don't want them to feel so cramped. My only idea here was to, besides replenishing the food supply, I thought that I might try to nudge the contents of this bin over a little bit and actually expand the size of the feeding area. Since I'm in no particular hurry to haul out the worms, I thought maybe we would just give them a little bit more space now that they're kind of coming together and starting to grow. So I think I'm going to do just that. And I guess maybe at the same time we'll take this as an opportunity to see what we see down here within this material. As you can see, this material is just beautiful. And once in a while, I think I just saw a baby worm. Or is it just a little stick or branch or something? It's a little bit hard to tell, but I believe right there we did encounter a baby worm. So it's no guarantee that your cocoons are going to hatch out in a specific amount of time. But I believe that the conditions in this bin are pretty optimal. I've been keeping the plastic coverings on to keep the moisture level pretty consistent and fairly high. And the temperatures are also starting to warm up a little bit now that we're in springtime. So I'm sure that that probably contributes to the speed at which the cocoons hatch. Since these are a tropical worm, these are theoretically African night crawlers, although a lot of people have commented when they look at my African night crawlers that they just somehow don't look like African night crawlers. So I kind of accept the fact that I might not actually be dealing with what I claim here, but since that's what I was told when I received the cocoons that these all originally hatched out of, I'm just kind of sticking to it. I mean, unless I could do some sort of conclusive identification of what kind of worms these actually are, I'm just going to continue calling them my African night crawlers. So I've definitely made myself a little bit of extra space here. And what I usually do is, I don't know, I just, for whatever reason, I like to try to push off the food and whatever new stuff I'm putting into the far outer edge. Because then maybe some of this more worked material can just eventually end up as being finished castings and get used in the gardening. And then the more freshly loaded materials can just go here on the far end and will most likely be hauled out with the worms when they finally get relocated into their new home. So besides some good sized worms, there's definitely a lot of little baby worms hanging out in here too, which is kind of cool. And that was precisely what this whole experiment was after. And I like the results. I don't remember if I've ever been this patient to wait this long. 47 days now. Coming up on 7 weeks of allowing Cocoon Nursery to have all of its babies hatch and all of its babies move over into the feeding end of the bin. I've had a lot of suggestions too, saying, you know, why not try baiting them somewhere centrally so they don't have so much distance to travel. I don't know. I'm not that worried about it. It's not like a college project or scientific experiment for a big company. It's just me tinkering. So I'm satisfied that this is a pretty decent approach to take. So I've got a variety of different bedding materials here on the side that we can use to sort of beef up this environment a little bit, because night crawlers definitely like their bedding. And I don't want to be stingy on it. So I'm going to take some of this shredded up newspaper that I created little strips of earlier. We'll drop that down into the bottom. That should serve as a pretty good foundation onto which we can plop a little bit of fresh food for them. So I bought down a whole variety of different this and that's from the freezer. So we've got some fresh leaves. I think what they got last time was mostly leafy stuff like this. So it's not a surprising observation that we don't really see many leftovers of the food that they received last time. And I mean, if I don't know, if you had to guess, how many worms do you think we got in there? I don't even know, but it definitely looks like we've got a few hundred, maybe more. So I don't want to get too skimpy on the food supply for them. It does seem like we've got a good number of growing mouths to feed in here. And since carbon is another aspect of their diet, not just a bedding material, but also a food source for them. Besides the newspaper, I'm chopping up some pieces of coffee filter in here. And the other good thing to include, since we're talking about baby worms here, is grit. The grit that I use here in my wormery is just pulverized eggshell. And I'm just wondering if maybe just a little bit more food can go in here, because, you know, we've got a whole bunch here. It's plenty for the other worm bin that we're going to feed. So we'll just give them a few more little bits of this and that. But I don't want to give them everything. Let's save what remains here for the other bin. It's not even that much at this point. But we'll give them all of this coffee. We'll give the other worms all this coffee. So that's a pretty fair feeding. And I've got this neem seed meal. So besides putting neem seed meal out here on the surface where the moisture is collecting underneath the plastic, I'm assuming that mites are probably also going to get drawn to the food supply over here too. So I'm going to make sure that I include neem seed meal over here too within the feeding area. Because, you know, like I said, neem seed meal doesn't have an immediate effect. It's that next generation that you observe not being there, which is the effect that I'm waiting on. And it's only been a few weeks since I adopted the use of this stuff, so I don't want to grow impatient and assume that it's not working. It might just be a matter of giving it more time. And I think we'll also get a better sense of what's going on by seeing the time lapse of the top surface of the material too. So I don't really get a chance to see that until I've taken the footage up to the computer and loaded it into the video editing software. So I'll be curious to see what that looks like too. Well, this piece of paper is pretty tattered, so it's not going to serve very well as a top covering, is it? Perhaps it can just be more bedding right on top, and we could take this piece of soiled paper towel. We'll kind of treat that as our top covering. I don't know why, I just like this whole idea of top coverings. Usually because I put plastic down. I don't like the idea of the plastic having all kinds of stuff adhere to it. So I always feel like if a little layer of something is in between, then it's going to prevent it from getting stuck to the plastic. So I don't know, I'm just trying to level things off here a little bit. I know that we nudged all of these beautiful finished castings up into a somewhat taller stack to make room over in the feeding area. And I know that I didn't build up the feeding area to be quite as high as the material. So we just have to remember that the next time we come in here, we don't want to get too jazzed when we see a huge difference in the level, because that doesn't really mean that they've just eaten all that bedding and food. It just means that the feeding area is a little bit lower in height than the rest of the bin. So I think we're just going to let this continue, and I'm just curious to see what this neem seed meal or this neem cake does in a somewhat longer time period, given enough time. And I guess the other thing is that I don't want to bring a whole bunch of mites over either. When it comes time to relocate these worms into the other system, I do feel like I've managed somehow to reduce the number of mites in that other system where the adult worms were moved into. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get in there. So let me move this one back up onto the shelf, and we'll go get the other bin that the adult worms are in. And we'll pick up where we left off. Okay, so here in the adult bin, or whatever you want to call it, the regular African nightcrawler system, there's a slightly different plastic covering here. It's still plastic, but it's not just a straight sheet of plastic bag like you saw in the cocoon nursery. I've been transitioning to bubble wrap in most of my systems because I think that between the bubbles where the air is allowed to circulate, I think it's a good thing. It's a positive thing. I guess the first thing I noticed was a little bit of mite activity. I could see a couple running around, but it doesn't look chronic. I'm just a little bit paranoid, I guess. Oh, I think we might actually have a little bit of an outbreak going on here. Gosh darn it. I'm seeing all these little white specks, and I don't remember seeing them last time we were in here 9 days ago. And I suppose it's my own fault. I don't think that I even used any of the neem seed meal in this new bin, because I had taken an approach when I had first populated this bin of using another material, and there's still traces of it visible in certain places. All these little white stains, if you will, on some of the bedding material out here on the edge. Those are remnants of me laying down a whole bunch of diatomaceous earth into this system. And diatomaceous earth is something that's going to pretty much wipe out most insects. Any sort of insect that has sort of a hard exoskeleton. And even though it kind of created a little bit of a traumatic experience for the worms and kind of made it difficult for them to initially settle into this environment, and I had to actually help them settle into the environment, it did seem to me like the diatomaceous earth had more or less knocked out almost all of the mites that I knew were kind of all over the worms when I released them into this space. Because for the past 47 days since the system's been in service, up until 9 days ago, every time I would look through here, I felt like I didn't really see any signs of mites. But I guess in 9 days a lot can change. Gosh darn it. I was kind of looking forward to referring to that as sort of a success story. But it does seem like if you don't maintain your success, you could lose it pretty quickly, and that does seem to be the case here. I'm just curious, you know, every time I see mites, I want to see them in fast motion so I could size up the situation a little bit better. I'm going to do the same here really quick just so we can get a better sense of what we're dealing with. Well, I've once again given 15 minutes to allow the time-lapse to film the slow-moving mites. It's also given me time to think, you know, I mean, while the nursery bin that we just checked in on, I'm content with, you know, allowing the neem seed meal test to sort of run its course so that maybe there we can observe whether it has the effect of reducing the number of mites. Here, I just don't really feel like I've got the patience to, you know, allow that to be the case. So I think I'm going with a more old-fashioned approach, which is to simply take all this mite-infested paper and get rid of it and remove it from the bin. And maybe, who knows, maybe it will account for a large number of the mites that are occupying the bin, because there was a good deal of moisture on the top surface. And hand in hand with the removal of this mite-infested paper, I did also know that that one sheet of newspaper that was covering these sheets was also quite thoroughly covered in mites too. So that's going away now as well. And when it comes time to cover this thing up, we're going to also eliminate that plastic covering, and we're going to go with a solution a little bit more like what I used to do in the olden days, which is just newspaper and cardboard. We're going to allow for a little bit of drying, and I don't know, maybe it's just back to the whole fact that we're in springtime now. The heat in the house just doesn't run quite as much, so the heat, I contribute the heating running in the house to creating a very dry environment, making the air in the house very dry. And now that it's not running quite as much, I think that there's just more humidity in the air, and it doesn't allow for the release of the moisture from my systems quite as much as when there's really dry air all winter long, and the air just sort of sucks the moisture out of my bins. And I don't know, we'll just see how it goes. I mean, you work your way down a little bit lower, you can see this material down here is looks a lot like leaf litter. Like if you have a leaf, kind of a leaf pile or a leaf compost pile outside, it's a lot of leafy material that seems to be breaking down nicely. I'm sure a lot of it is worm castings as well. But it's not overly damp, even though the top surface was seemingly overly damp. We just had to go down a little bit within the material to meet some really nice flaky stuff, which I'm glad of. I've just been really dealing with a lot of overly damp, overly clumpy worm bins lately. So I think I'm going to sort of try to swing in the opposite direction a little bit and try to manage the moisture in such a way that I have far drier bins, which is also kind of a throwback to the way I used to run my bins in the early days. But back in the early days, I just never seemed to have an issue with mites. So I'm just wondering if the mite issue goes hand in hand with the increased moisture that you get when you start covering your bins really thoroughly with plastic. So here you can see some of that diatomaceous earth still stuck to some of this cardboard and paper. When I had introduced the worms into the system, I pretty much plopped them into a big pile of diatomaceous earth, which really didn't make them very happy. They all sort of piled up, never made their way down into the bedding, and then I actually had to sort of help the worms submerge down into the lower levels of the bin where there was a lot of moisture and there was some nice damp bedding and there was no diatomaceous earth. But I used so much of it that even now, 47 days later, I'm still trying to just sort of blend the stuff in. So every time I encounter some material that's still somewhat caked and covered with the stuff. I want to try to blend this stuff in, and in time it'll all become invisible and vanish, but there's still some significant traces of it stuck to certain bits of material in here. So even out here on the edges, we're, bumping into worms here and there. But we did feed down the middle, and that's probably where we would expect to find the greatest number of worms. That's where we're going to feed again today, so let's make our way over into there and see how things are coming along after 9 days since we last fed. So right away, as we start peeling back a little bit of the material in here, we're beginning to observe where a lot of the worms are hanging out amongst the more damp stuff, which is where the food was placed in. I'm just taking a moment to see if I can observe mites down here. Because like here, for example, we've got a half of an orange, which a lot of people said would be a place where not only worms would want to kind of congregate, but we might also see an outbreak of mites. And down here right beneath it, I'm wondering if that's what we're seeing some of. It's hard to tell. It looks like we're bumping into a little bit of the coffee that was probably added into this feeding area last time. Once again, a good number of worms. I got mites on the brain. A good number of worms hanging out, enjoying the coffee too. And I don't recall what other types of foods were included in the last feeding. But the orange is clearly an easily recognizable item. It looks like there's a lot of little tiny worms hanging out here too. They probably appreciate the sugar content and the moisture. Like now here I start to see little white specks. I can't tell if they're mites or what they are. But I believe that I'm going to have to start using the neem seed meal, the neem cake in here too. Because even though I don't really feel like I've got conclusive results yet on that stuff working in any of my bins, I don't even know if I've really seen much reduction in the mite numbers since I've been using this stuff for the past few weeks. I'm going to stick with the whole idea of just trying to be a little bit more faithful and trusting that in time it will start to produce the results that we're after of reducing the mites. Because I have to assume that there's mites down here too within the food, but I'm not going to shoot any more time-lapse. I'm just going to take an approach that says, yeah, we probably have mites to deal with, so let's include some neem seed meal, and hopefully it'll work the way it's supposed to work. So I'm going to start blending this stuff in. This is the neem seed meal. I'm going to combine it with some of this fresh bedding that we're placing in here, a little bit of stripped up newspaper. I guess we'll just try to blend it in with some of the stuff that's already down in here. I'll try to leave that orange, that half of an orange, sort of in the middle, so that we know where it's at. And we can find it easily the next time we come in here. Although it's kind of hard to miss, I'm sure we would have no problem locating it in the future. And another good thing to always include in your bins is the grit, right? So let's give them a little of that as well. And the foods that we've got for them, more coffee. The coffee's been piling up. I recently went through a little problem in my wormery, and if you're a regular, you already know that I had a significant die-off of pretty much all my red wiggler worms. So I'm virtually down to maybe half or less than half of the worms that I had once upon a time, and it's pretty much all night crawlers at this point. And I would like at some point to try to repopulate my wormery with more red wigglers again. Well, I don't know what happened, but the camera just suddenly decided to stop filming without giving me any warning. So I had already gotten to the point where I had covered the bin up and did my traditional customary greeting and signed off, and then I realized that halfway through the feeding, the camera had just stopped. So I just figured I'd uncover the bin here to try to bring it back to a state that's similar to the way that it looked when the camera stopped rolling. Just so you can see how I'm covering up at this point. The mite-infested newspapers, I'm taking that stuff outside. I'm leaving the bubble wrap off. And we're going to go to a much drier solution. It's going to leave the material here on the top surface a lot drier, I believe. So we're going to swap out those mite-infested pieces of newspaper with some fresh paper. And rather than having plastic over the top, resulting in little puddles and a lot of dampness on top, which seems to be a space that the mites really like to hang out in, we're going to deny them of that. And we're going to switch to some materials that I believe are going to result in somewhat drier material right beneath it. And that might also result in a little bit less worm activity right there at the surface, but we're going to give this a try and see if we're able to, maybe combining dryness with the neem seed cake and combined with just the removal of a lot of the mites that we observed, see if we can get this bin under control again. Jeez Louise. All right, everyone. I've still got a few more things to take care of as far as putting stuff away and getting things cleaned up, but I'm not going to bore you with that. I'm just going to sign off at this point, but before I do, let me just say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.